Over the last 30 years, the major Gulf states and the city of Dubai in particular have been pitching themselves to the global economy as business hubs that could serve as a center of modern commerce. The states have offered very low or often zero taxes, easy paths to residency, world-class airlines to physically connect to other commercial centers, a lot of luxury facilities to spend all that money, all in what was considered a convenient location and a central point between a majority of the world's population centers. Above all, though, these centers promoted the idea that they were safe for wealthy Westerners who could be cocooned away from these states' religious conservatism, authoritarian leadership, human rights abuses, and of course, wider regional instability. Everybody knew these ugly sides were there. But for a little while, it became profitable enough for a lot of people to ignore with the tacit understanding that as long as nobody stepped out of line, this was a safe space for tourists to do a stopover. Or more importantly, for wealthy individuals to run a business and keep almost all of their money to themselves. It was a story that worked well enough for a lot of the world's wealthiest people, making it the #1 destination for multimillionaire immigrants and expats, according to some estimates. But that story has changed. In the early hours of the morning on the 1st of March, the Dubai International Airport was hit by an airstrike launched from Iran in retaliation to attacks from the USA and Israel. The strikes also hit hotels, a regional Amazon data center, shipping ports alongside domestic and foreign military bases. In the months since the UAE started getting caught in the crossfire of this conflict, their own government has claimed to have intercepted more than 1,000 inbound aerial attacks, with no direct mention of how many have actually got through. Even in the most direct sense, these ongoing attacks have had real casualties, done real damage, and represent a real ongoing threat to the self-declared safest city in the world. But as many internal outlets and paid influencers have been quick to point out, in the grand scheme of things, these strikes were relatively incidental to the city as a whole. What wasn't, though, was the reaction to them. Within the span of just 30 days, the city has made it much harder to ignore the underlying reality of the manufactured utopia they were trying to create. And this alone is going to have serious long-term consequences on their economy. Covering Iran is very difficult without crossing into the political landscape. The Gulf states have known for a long time that oil wealth won't last forever, and even if there are still huge reserves left in the ground, running an entire economy off a single export category is very risky. And per capita, we are actually less oil dependent today than we were during the last major oil crisis in 1980. Now, most people think the idea was to become a destination for travelers who would bring money into the country to replace the oil industry. And while that was certainly part of the equation, it was actually only a small part of it. The real game plan was to become a hub of New World business activity, positioning themselves as a new Singapore, Hong Kong, or Switzerland. Neutral, low tax, and perfect for wealthy people who could come there and develop a services economy around them. Now, this is an important distinction because Singapore, Hong Kong, and Switzerland didn't become financial centers by building skyscrapers and hoping bankers would show up. They developed strong institutions, rule of law, and deep pools of skilled labor over generations. And the financial infrastructure followed naturally from that. Even Singapore, which had some of the most intense decades of economic growth ever, still started off with very unglamorous development. The Gulf states were trying to do the same thing, but in reverse and much faster. To do this, they developed a literal build-it-and-they-will-come approach. The Gulf states have become infamous for their grand mega projects, some better thought out than others. But the big fancy projects touted as tourist magnets were just as much about establishing a critical mass of commercial activity to get major multinationals to set up operations in the country. The same logic was used to redirect enormous funding towards world-leading national airlines like ETA, Emirates, and Qatar Airways. These airlines were heavily subsidized by their respective governments, sometimes to the tune of billions of dollars, which allowed them to offer routes and service levels that would be completely uneconomical for a privately funded carrier. The logic was straightforward, even if the economics were questionable, in the short term. If they made it easy and pleasant for global business people to pass through their city, some of them would eventually stay for a stopover, a convention, or even long-term, and the money they bring in will more than pay for the airline subsidies over time. This not only put these countries on the map and made them easier to travel to, it also made the airlines a business opportunity in their own right. Emirates alone quickly went from a cost of doing business into a massively successful business in its own right. These countries already knew this was a potential problem, which is why they have built up strategic food reserves. But those reserves are generally measured at around 3 to 6 months of basic commodities like grains and rice, and they will not last forever. It's as of yet unclear if the USA is going to be willing to step in and organize something like a modern Berlin airlift if these countries become fully cut off from outside support to the point it becomes a genuine crisis. Now for context, the Berlin airlift in 1948 supplied a city of about 2 million people, and it required the largest sustained air transport operation in history at the time. So, replicating something like that for a region with tens of millions of people living in even more extreme conditions would be an enormously complex and expensive undertaking even if the political will existed. The second area of concern is damage to critical infrastructure. These countries have extremely vulnerable infrastructure like power grids and desalination plants that could be targeted, further crippling what are essentially life support systems for populations many times too large to be living in such an unsupported environment. More than 90% of the Gulf's desalinated water supply comes from just 56 major plants, and this concentration of essential infrastructure within range of Iranian missiles represents an almost existential vulnerability. In extreme cases like Qatar, more than 99% of drinking water for the country's 3.2 million people comes from desalination, and the country does not have sufficient storage capacity to buffer a significant supply interruption. If those desalination plants are destroyed or severely damaged, the country could quite literally become uninhabitable within weeks because there is simply no natural freshwater alternative in sufficient quantities to support the population. The third big problem, and arguably the most damaging in the long term, is the blow to the stability and confidence these countries have painstakingly been building up over decades. And this is worth dwelling on for a moment because confidence is not just a nice word that economists throw around. It's the actual foundation that the entire Gulf economic model is built on. Nobody moves to a desert country with no democratic protections and no social safety net unless they are confident that the upside of doing so, the low taxes, the business opportunities, the lifestyle, outweighs the risks. The moment that calculation changes, even just psychologically, the whole model starts to unravel. The attacks themselves were a very visible demonstration that these are still countries in a vulnerable region of the world. But to make matters significantly worse, the governments themselves, especially in Dubai, cracked down on people sharing these events online. This shattered two illusions on the same day: the illusion of safety and the illusion of a fair and balanced government that respects basic personal freedoms. For a lot of wealthy residents, this was a worse signal than the attacks themselves because it confirmed that the freedoms they enjoyed were conditional and could be revoked the moment they became inconvenient. Tourism, which had become a major industry in its own right, collapsed almost overnight. The major airlines they had built up using their cities as a hub have been largely grounded, with Emirates forced to ground nearly 250 wide-body aircraft and over 23,000 flights canceled across the region's major carriers since the escalation began. Emirates alone reportedly lost over $1 billion in revenue within the first week, and the airline has stated that delayed aircraft deliveries and grounded routes have cost the company roughly $10 billion in missed revenue opportunities. Jet fuel prices certainly haven't helped either, but that is a wider issue for everybody, to be fair. The bigger blow, though, may be to their ambitions of being a global business hub. Wealthy people who can live anywhere generally don't want to live in a place that could be dragged into a war. And carefully controlled media and influencers did their best to play down these concerns. But the picture is still pretty clear. There is certainly nobody lining up to move their family to Dubai right now, no matter how great the tax breaks and supercars are. And this is where the real economic vulnerability kicks in. Because remember that the entire model depends on a steady inflow of wealthy immigrants who buy property, start businesses, and spend money. Before the crisis, the UAE was on track to attract nearly 10,000 new millionaires in 2025. But obviously, those projections are now meaningless. Even the millionaires who are already there have started reassessing whether this is really where they want to keep their families and their fortunes. Since a lot of the wealthy residents of these countries were immigrants to begin with, there is much less holding them in place compared to a situation where it was their true homeland. When you move somewhere for the tax breaks and the lifestyle, you can just as easily move somewhere else when those advantages are undermined. And that's exactly what a lot of people are now doing, or at least planning to do. This has resulted in some things that from the outside you can't help but feel a bit of schadenfreude over. Like wealthy tax exiles who have spent years talking endlessly about how incompetent their tax-hungry government is, begging that very same government to get them back home by any means necessary, preferably on a taxpayer-funded emergency flight. Now, nobody can predict the future, least of all economists, but there's going to be some fallout from this. These countries are going to be hit with a major financial shock as some of their biggest industries are completely pulled out from under them. They could, in theory, replace some of that lost revenue by cashing in on higher oil prices because global oil prices have surged significantly since the Strait closure. But the problem is they can't actually sell their oil right now, and they probably won't be able to until this whole situation de-escalates, which means the one asset that could bail them out in a crisis is sitting in the ground while the crisis plays out around them. It's a bit like having a fire extinguisher locked inside the burning building. The real estate market is also going to face serious pressure. If wealthy foreign buyers stop coming in, or worse, start trying to sell their properties to get out, you have the ingredients for a pretty significant correction in a market where foreign nationals hold 43% of all residential property value. Remember that over 300,000 new units are currently under construction in Dubai, most of which were planned and financed on the assumption that demand from wealthy immigrants would keep growing indefinitely. If those units come online into a market where demand has collapsed, developers are going to be stuck with enormous amounts of unsold inventory, and the banks that finance those projects are going to be left holding loans secured against assets that are worth significantly less than what was borrowed against them. That matters because in Dubai, real estate is not just an investment vehicle. It's a core part of the economy's output, employment, and tax base. And a correction in property values would send shockwaves through construction, banking, retail, and basically every other sector that has been riding the boom. This is the same kind of cascading financial shock that brought down the Irish economy in 2008, and it took Ireland nearly a decade to fully recover. And Ireland had the backing of the European Union and a highly educated workforce that could pivot to other industries relatively quickly. Advantages that Dubai does not necessarily share to the same extent. Now, in the grand scheme of things, it's hard to feel too sorry for these countries as sovereign entities, especially since they have made things worse for themselves through the crackdowns on free expression. But there could be a genuine humanitarian crisis brewing. A lot of workers, particularly migrant laborers who are already in precarious situations, won't have as many jobs to work as construction slows and businesses close. These workers are likely to be the last ones out the door if things get really bad. Because unlike the wealthy expats, they don't have a home government chartering emergency flights for them. Many of these workers come from countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the Philippines. And they've been sending money home to support their families, which means any disruption to their employment doesn't just affect them. It ripples out across some of the world's most vulnerable economies. So the consequences of a slowdown in the Gulf extend well beyond the region itself. The longer this conflict carries on, the more these countries are going to be starved of vital imports, critical infrastructure maintenance, and their steady supply of wealthy immigrants moving in to prop up their housing and business markets. And that cycle is very hard to restart once it stops, because the entire model was built on confidence. And confidence once broken takes a very long time to rebuild. There are plenty of examples in economic history of countries that built their growth model around being a stable, attractive destination for foreign capital, and then lost that reputation and spent decades trying to get it back. Lebanon being perhaps the most sobering example of a once thriving financial hub that was never able to recapture what it lost. Now, Dubai obviously has far more resources and institutional backing than Lebanon ever did, but the underlying lesson is the same. You can spend 30 years carefully building a brand and lose it in 30 days. Now, this whole situation is concentrated on these individual countries, but the effects are going to be felt everywhere through higher energy prices and stagnated economic activity, which is a combination economists have a specific word for.